Hello everyone, my name is Angelica Chivinversia, and today I will tell you about what is language. Language refers to a system of communication consisting of a set of sounds, symbols, and rules for combining them to convey meaning. From the source that I take on www.cambridge.org, language is foremost a means of communication, and communication almost and always takes place within some sort of social context. For example, they tell you when to use slang with a friend or formal language with a boss, how to judge a candidate's campaign speeches, and whether to abbreviate an email. Move on to linguistics. Linguistics is the scientific study of language. Linguistics examines the properties of language, such as grammar, phonetics, syntax, semantics, and how these properties are used to convey meaning in different contexts. Continue. What is language? From 1.1.1. Human beings can communicate with each other using language. Humans are able to exchange knowledge, beliefs, opinion, wishes, threats, comments, thanks, promises, declarations, or feelings, and only our imagination sets limits. We can laugh to express amusement, happiness, or disrespect. We can smile to express amusement or fear. We can clench our fist or express determination, anger, or threat. We can raise our eyebrows to express surprise or disapproval, and so on. But our system of communication before anything else is language. Communication by means of language may be referred to as linguistics communication. The other ways mentioned above, laughing, smiling, shrieking, and so on, are types of non-linguistic communication. Chimpanzees, gorillas, and orangutans can exchange different kinds of information by emitting different kinds of shrieks, composing their faces in numerous ways, and moving their hands or arms in different gestures. But they do not have words and sentences. Language is an exclusive human property. Among the characteristics that make a relatively clear distinction between linguistics and non-linguistic communication, meaningful are two particular and important things. They are double articulation and syntax. Languages consist of tens of thousands of signs, which are combination of forms and meanings. Forms in spoken language are sequences of sounds, letters in written languages, and gestures in sign languages of the deaf. An example is the English word breathe. From Wiley Online Library that was mentioned by Thomas R. Weir. Double articulation refers to the property of human languages in which meaningful words are composed of meaningless sounds. This also entry surveys what it is, how it differs from other properties like arbitrariness and productivity, whether it is a true human universal and its evolutionary origins. Double articulation refers to the formal sides of signs in languages, which are built from a small repertoire of meaningless sounds. In English, there are around 50 sounds, divided between consonants and vowels, with no connection between meaning and any of the sounds. In a language without double articulation, the formal sides of all signs will be composed by individual sounds, with the number of different sounds equal to the number of signs. Now let's move on to syntax. Syntax, the arrangement of words in sentences, clauses, and phrases, and the formation of sentences and their relationship with their component parts. The principle of double articulation has enabled humans to create languages with a large number of signs, But the inventor of signs in a language is finite. The number of sounds in a language typically ranges from 10 to 100, making it impossible to have hundreds of thousands of different signs unless they are extremely long. The total number of isolated signs in a human language is generally limited to 10,000 to 20,000, and we cannot talk about an infinite number of meanings unless we combine them. Syntax is used to put together signs expressing relatively simple meanings into sign combinations, expressing more complex meanings. To express a meaning like man killed lion, we combine signs meaning man, kill, past, and lion. And we combine the same signs in a different way to express the meaning. Lion killed man. Syntax is a mechanism that enables human beings to utter or understand an infinite number of sentences constructed from a finite number of building blocks. Without syntax, we will not be able to express other meanings than those associated with isolated signs and the number of different meanings we could express will be equal to the number of signs in the language. Now let's move on to the function of language. Use language for an almost infinite number of purposes, from writing letters, gossiping with our friends, making speeches, and talking to ourselves in front of the mirror. However, there are a number of recurring functions which, despite the many different uses we make of language, are generally being served. Some are apparently so ordinary as almost to pass unnoticed as function, whilst others are more lofty and almost abstract. The important thing to recognize is that, linguistically speaking, they are all of equal importance. Microfunction, as the name suggests, cover the particular individual uses, while macrofunctions relate to the larger, more general purposes underlying language use. Now let's move on to microfunctions of language. The microfunctions of language are as follows. The first one is to release nervous or physical energy, or that we can call it psychological function. This may seem a rather trivial function, but in fact, a good deal of language use has a psychological purposes. Move on to fatigue function. It is surprising how often we use language for no other reason than simply to signal our general disposition to be sociable. Linguist stories make it clear how important the fatigue use of language is in creating and maintaining social links. Move on to a recording function. This is a more obviously serious use of language than the previous two, although not necessarily more significant. We are constantly using language to record things we wish to remember. It might be a short-term record, or as in a shopping list or a list of things to do, or a long-term record as in a diary or history of some kind. Next one is identifying function. Language not only allows us to record but also to identify, with considerable precision, an enormous array of objects and events, without which it will be very difficult to make sense of the world around us. Learning the names of things allows us to refer quickly and accurately to them. It gives us power over them. Next one is the reasoning function. All of us have a running commentary going on in our heads during our waking hours. Like breathing, it is automatic. And then Schizophrenics are acutely conscious of it and imagine it to be coming from someone else. Move on to communicating function. This is probably the function that most people would select first as the principal purpose of language. And clearly, it is an extremely important function, but as we have just seen, the relationship between language and meaning can be problematic. Communication is a two-way process. There are, of course, a variety of reasons which may prompt the act of communication. We use language for requesting, informing, ordering, promising, and reprimanding, to mention just a few. In all these cases, we could say that language is being used to perform certain speech acts, or more specifically, direct speech acts. And the last one is pleasure function. There are various kinds of pleasure which we derive from language. Most of it, poetry exploits this function. Devices such as onomatopoeia, alliteration, and assonance all draw on the pleasure we find in euphony, as do rhythm and rhyme. Now let's move on to macro functions of language. Macro function of language is a better way of describing the macro function of language would be to follow the linguist Michael Halliday and call them meta functions. A meta function is one which is capable of describing one or more other functions. Let's go to the macro functions of language. The first one is additional function. With the number of the micro function identified above, we can see that there is a common mental or conceptualizing process involved. In using language to identify things or as an instrument of thoughts or to provide a record, we are using language as a symbolic code to represent the world around us. Next one is the interpersonal function. Several of the microfunctions are concerned with the relationship between ourselves and other people or things. We gain much of our sense of identity, of who and what we are, from our relationships both with animate and inanimate things. And language is an essential part of that personalizing process. Using language as a means of communication for purposes of phatic communication, for phatic communion, or to release nervous or physical energy, involves activities in which we are prioritizing the interpersonal function of language. The next one is the poetic function. Any functional account of language must take into consideration that side of our nature in which, rather than conceptualizing the world or interacting with it, we are simply just playing with it. In this sense, the word poetic doesn't mean the ability to write poetry. It means the ability to bring the world into being as an area of play. And the last one is the textual function. Textual function is one more function of language which has not been discussed so far. That is, textual function. It relates to our ability to construct text out of our utterance and writings. We can see it as using language to bring text into being. When we speak or write, we don't normally confine ourselves to single phrases or sentences. We string these together to make connected sequences. Now let's go to language overview. Language is one of the most wonderful gifts given by God to humanity. It is, with help of language that humans are able to communicate and solve a number of their problems and have been able to make a lot of achievements in their lives. Language reflects both the individual characteristics of a person as well as the beliefs and practices of his and her community. Languages are rule-governed systems, which are made up of signs. So, for an outsider to learn the language of a community, he or she must learn which signs are meaningful and which are not. Move on to language definition. Although many people study about language may disagree over a precise definition of language because they dispute some concepts such as whether or not language must have a written and oral component. They agree that language is a rule-based system of signs. Saying that language is a rule-based system is usually makes people think of other kinds of situations where rules are enforced by a particular authority. For example, about the classroom behavior. Students are expected to sit still, to stay quiet, and pay attention, and so on. Typically, there are consequences if they don't follow a lot of these rules. Okay. Language rules, however, are not enforced by an authority figure. Language police do not exist. Instead, language rules are conventions. This means that they come into existence through common practice by users of the language rather than through the imposition of an authority figure. As a result, members who use the language conventions of their particular community may not even be conscious of following them. Now let's talk about language as a system of rules or conventions, because a single language convention, for example, a single word, a pause, or an alphabet letter, does not tell us much beyond its immediate meaning. Thus, we usually combine these conventions together to convey larger meanings. Sign language is a communication system that uses hand gestures, body movements, and facial expressions to convey meaning, especially for deaf or hard of hearing individuals. Signs can be sounds, words, and punctuation marks, or even silence. They work on two levels, indicating the physical medium and portraying the message itself. For example, the word goose represents the concept of a bird. Signs can come through sounds, sights, or physical movements, with Braille being an example of touch convey sign. I'm going to give you two examples. The first one is American Sign Language, or most people say it ASL. ASL is one of the most commonly used sign languages in the United States and Canada. It has its own distinct signs for words and concepts, and is not mutually intelligible with other sign languages. There are a lot of variation, or numerous sign languages worldwide, with each country generally having its own native sign language. The number of sign languages is not precisely known, but it is estimated to be over 200. And now go to arbitrary sign. An arbitrary sign doesn't have an inherent connection with its meaning. As seen in the word door in American English, it varies across languages and is learned through experiences, reading, or language teaching. Even onomatopoeic words are arbitrary within a culture, highlighting the close link between a culture and its language. The sound of a bird, for example, can be represented differently in different languages, highlighting the cultural perspective behind language. Language is a crucial tool for communication, often occurring within a social context. Effective communication requires understanding the connections between language and its users, which can be complex and include using slang, formal language, judging speeches, and abbreviating emails. These connections are influenced by cultural and social forces, particularly within the United States. Social context is a significant factor in language choices, as seen in interviews where people may be more concerned with how they speak than what they say. Move on to language and communication. Language is also a means of making decisions about others, often evaluating a person's education, socio-economic status, background, honesty, and friendliness based on their languages. We consciously choose our language to make a particular impression on others, just as we choose our hairstyles or even clothing. Language is intertwined with our personal and broader societal identities as it communicates our individual thoughts and cultural beliefs and practices. Language is essential in communicating our thoughts and experiences within our families, social groups and associations. Now let's get into 1.2, the concept of language. Language is a complex and multidimensional concept that serves as a tool for sharing ideas, feelings, and desires. It is a skill that humans use to communicate with others, and it is essential for poetry, prose, and drama. Language is a unified system of elements associated with one another, aiming to establish a ground for communication. The dimensions of meaning, pragmatics, syntax, and phonetics are studied accordingly. Language is described as something enabling man to constitute an artificial world separate from the real world with its own principles. It is an arbitrary system based on social conventions and consists of figures of speech bonded with accidental sounds in a unity of sound and meaning. The first property of language is conventionality, which means that we express a being by using another being, such as a symbol. The second property is collectiveness, which means that we understand or think the same object or concept when one word is uttered to read. The persistence of language is closely related to collectiveness, and the tone of the properties determining accurate use of language is determined by its widespreadness over space and time. The third property is arbitrariness, which is acceptable on the dimension of vocabulary, meaning that the being and the name used to represent that being are arbitrary. The concept of language has been a subject of debate, with some arguing that the meaning of words is already inherent in the essence of the word or is attached by humans. Linguistics has explained this by identifying two types of resources. The first one is internal elements, and the second one is external elements. Internal elements are fundamental and formed by adding or removing affixes within the boundaries of language, while external elements are formed by borrowing from other languages. Ferdinand de Saussure proposed a triple classification of language. There are langage, langue, and parole. Langage refers to the ability to use a system for communicating ideas and feelings using sounds, gestures, signs, or marks, which is peculiar to humans. Langue refers to the underlying rules governing the combination and organization of elements and language, such as grammar, vocabulary, and pronunciation systems, while parole is any meaningful utterance, either spoken or written, and is personal, dynamic, and social activity. Another issue of debate is the use of language by animals. Animals use nonverbal communication, which is instinctive, innate, and transferred heritably, while human language are acquired and learned through education and cultural heritage. Animal language expresses sensual conditions, while human language goes beyond expressions and uses signals instead of symbols. Karl Popper identified 4 functions of language. It is manifestation of oneself, sign interchange, description, and argumentation. Both animals and humans can manifest psychological conditions and react in certain ways, but animals cannot set forth descriptions and argumentations. The development of these upper level functions is necessary for better use of lower level functions. First language. First language is the language which a child acquires first when the child learns to communicate with the people around. The language that is taught or used for the communication by someone's mother is the first language to his or her child. The child first learns the language that is his or her native language. Second language. The term second language can refer to any language that is learned subsequent to the mother tongue. Thus, it can even refer to the learning of third or fourth language. The main objective of the second language is to enable the speaker for wider participation in society and the nation, leading to secondary socialization. Hence, the second language is usually the official language of a state or national language. Foreign language. Foreign language is a language which is not a native language in a country. A foreign language is usually studied either for communication with foreigners who speak the language. Now let's move on to what is linguistics. Well, linguistics is the scientific study of language. Linguistics examines the properties of language, such as grammar, phonetics, syntax, semantics, and how these properties are used to convey meaning in different contexts. Linguistics provides for a rigorous experimentation with the elements or aspects of language that are actually in use by the speech community. The scientific nature of linguistics. Science is a systematic, explicit, and objective study for an object or phenomenon, natural or social. It involves gathering data, analyzing it, determining the relationship between facts, formulating explanations, verifying and validating explanations, and generalizing. In the context of language study, science implies a systematic investigation into language using control and objectively verifiable proposition based on observations and general theories governing language. Linguistic procedure involves generating testable hypotheses to make predictions about language, and if it found false, alternative hypotheses are formulated to arrive at absolute truth. Linguistics aims to study the nature of language and establish a theory of language, and to describe a language and all languages by applying the established theory. To be scientific, linguistic procedures must satisfy 3 essential conditions: explicitness, systematicness, and objectivity. Traditional grammar, for example, lacks explicitness and definitions, which often lack clarity about abstract nouns. Let's Let's move on to linguistics and fields of linguistics. Linguistics is the scientific study of language divided into sound, sentence structure, meaning, psycholinguistics, and pragmatics. Originally, it was philology studying the history of words and their evolution. It has evolved into a technical field with separate fields like phonetics, syntax, semantics, and pragmatics. Move on to modern linguistics. Linguistics is the systematic study of language elements and their organization, while philology, an older term, focuses on comparative and historical studies. Comparative studies examine similarities and differences within related languages, while historical studies analyze language evolution over time. Saussure introduced new concepts and procedures in language analysis. Now, after I told you everything about what is language, I hope all of you can understand of it, and thank you.